This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. This is a show where we peel back the layers on today's news and more, just like a banana, except we hold the stem at the bottom because we know exactly what we're doing. Here's what we got for y'all. Our top story comes with a warning. We'll be discussing domestic and sexual violence. So, if you prefer to step away, we'll see you a little later in the show. We're talking about self-defense in cases of abuse and domestic violence. 1 in 4 women in the US experiences domestic violence each year, and in some cases, confrontations with their abusers can turn fatal. When women argue they killed their abusers in self-defense, they can receive very long sentences. A study from the Sentencing Project shows that of 42 women convicted of murder in California for killing someone they said abused them, all but 2 had received life sentences. And a DOJ study that surveyed 60 incarcerated women in the Southeast found that almost half of them were serving time for acting in self-defense in response to violence their partner initiated. When these cases go to court, it's difficult to successfully prove self-defense. University of Maryland law professor Lee Goodmark specializes in gender-based violence. She explained to us why these cases are so difficult to argue.
There are problems in the way that police and prosecutors and judges look at women who use force. Because women who use force are aberrant. So to make a case for self-defense, you have to show that you had a reasonable belief that you were facing death or serious bodily harm, and that death was imminent, and that you used only the force that was necessary to protect yourself. So there are a bunch of problems in there for women, the size and strength thing, right? So what kind of force is reasonable when you're fighting off a much bigger person?
These laws are pretty consistent from state to state. Another important factor to consider is when the act of self-defense occurs. If it's between incidents of abuse when the victim's life may not be in immediate danger, then it's more difficult to prove they were at risk.
Our system is only equipped to deal with victims and perpetrators, and you can't be both. So at the minute that you become a criminal defendant, you do not get to be a victim anymore.
Look at the case of Centoya Brown. She is a sex trafficking victim who served 15 years of a life sentence for killing a man in self-defense who brought her to his home when she was 16. After her case gained widespread attention, she was released early in 2019. But Brown is not alone. There are also people like Crystal Kaiser, who killed her sexual abuser when she was 17. Her case was taken up by Kenosha County, the same court where Kyle Rittenhouse successfully argued his case for self-defense. Her case is now being reviewed by the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
You have to fit within a pretty narrow category of victim for police, prosecutors, judges to be willing to see you as a victim. You have to have no responsibility. You have to be kind of pure and the kind of the perfect victim or the innocent victim. You can't be angry. You can't have fought back in the past. You can't be using drugs. You can't have a mental health history. You can't have any of those things.
You might be wondering, but what happens if there is overwhelming evidence to support the claim of self-defense? Goodmark says that doesn't always make a difference.
I'm not sure that more cameras, more documents, I don't think anything changes that. I think it's about the ways in which we perceive battered people, particularly women, and I haven't said it yet, but I shouldn't go any longer without saying it, particularly women of color, and especially Black women.
It's important to note that abuse is a cycle, both for the victims and the perpetrators. The Department of Health and Human Services reports nearly 1 in every 100 girls in the US are abused as children, ranging from neglect to physical and sexual abuse. Research shows that women who are abused in their youth are more likely to be victims of abuse as adults. A study published in the journal Child Maltreatment followed over 5,000 children with documented cases of abuse for 16 years. The research found that boys who were abused as children became abusive to their partners in adulthood, but that was not true for women. Beyond the US, this is a global issue. A United Nations study says that the home is the most dangerous place for women. Nearly 60% of women homicide victims were killed by a partner or family members.
This is a problem that we have been talking about in this country for a very, very long time, and you get these waves of publicity, and I'm hopeful that maybe this time we'll talk about it a little bit differently, given where we are as a country in terms of looking at the criminal legal system.
So we want to stay on this topic and bring in an expert to help us break things down. Last week, we got to sit down with Ruth Glenn, the president and CEO of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, an organization dedicated to supporting survivors and holding offenders accountable and supporting advocates. Ruth is also a survivor of domestic abuse and can speak to this topic firsthand. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us on In the Loop.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to have this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. With you being here, clearly we have an opportunity to learn more about the dynamics of abusive relationships. Can you take a moment to explain why it is survivors and victims decide to stay with their abusers?
So there's a couple of elements, even around language, that you just mentioned that I'd like to clarify. I think one of the first problems that we have in our society about talking about domestic violence is calling it an abusive relationship. That puts the onus on both the person who's causing the harm and the victim of that harm. So even that term is a little concerning when we're talking about domestic violence. I think it also does some parts of victim blaming. Not understanding all of the elements and the dynamics of domestic violence that a victim needs to address before they can feel empowered and safe and comfortable separating from somebody who's abusive. The variables can go from anything from I need to consider my safety, much like I had to do, to where am I going to put my kids in school? Will I still be able to keep my job? Is this person going to hurt me and hunt me and stalk me? My family doesn't know what's happened. How will I share that with them? So there's this very, very long list for every survivor about things they must consider if they feel like they need to leave. And we always suggest that they're the best barometers of that. They know what they're up against. So them deciding not to leave is not necessarily them staying. It's making a really informed decision about not leaving.
I appreciate the clarification on language because being in this business, you understand how important language is. So I feel like we're getting a pretty good education here, and I thank you for that.
Good.
A mission of your organization is to promote legislation that helps survivors and victims of domestic violence. How have our legal systems fallen short, and what can be done to see that survivors and victims get the support that they need?
So I think I always look at it from a couple of places. One is we still have a society that is very uncomfortable talking about domestic violence. It's a private matter. It's messy business. We don't know how to hold abusive persons accountable. We don't understand the dynamics of domestic violence. So then when you take that as society that's still not comfortable with it and still struggling about what is it, and then you ask them to develop policies and or enforce policies that would promote the safety and well-being of survivors of domestic violence and or address the interventions and preventions that we need to address domestic violence, it can get really icky. When we're talking about that, we quite frequently, for instance, when we're talking about housing, there's a housing bill before Congress. Are there elements of that housing bill that might be harmful to domestic violence survivors? We use all of those opportunities, very much like we are today, to allow people to have some of the terminology and the dialogue about that so that they are comfortable, even in legislation, talking about why this might be harmful or why this might be good for a domestic violence victim or survivor.
Ruth Glenn is the president and CEO of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Ruth, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
If you or anyone you know is a victim of domestic violence, call 1-800-799-SAFE or text START to 88788.